Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Let me just get my slides shared here. Friends, colleagues, thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Joshua Simmons, and as noted, I'm a senior open source strategist at Salesforce and president of the Open Source Initiative, the nonprofit that stewards the open source definition and the OSI approved license list. I go by Josh, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm speaking to you today from bucolic Petaluma, California, land of the Lekatuit and Coast Miwok. I've had many different relationships with open source over the last 20 years, 22 years to be exact. Over the last 6, I've had the great honor of working as a community manager in one form or another, serving the entire open source ecosystem. And in that time, I've developed some thoughts about the ecosystem's health and the threats that it faces. We face many challenges, but today I'm here to speak to you about just one: a pervasive lack of awareness about the open source ecosystem, most specifically, its foundations. Modern software development wouldn't be possible but for the work of countless nonprofits. Yet we, the benefactors of their work, largely labor in blissful ignorance of this hidden infrastructure. I did for 15 years. Now, granted, we're all here at EclipseCon, so this may be something that you as an audience are a little more educated on than the average person in this ecosystem. My career kicked off as a freelance web developer, in which I was selling my services producing Drupal and WordPress-powered websites. I used and benefited from free and open source software for about 15 years before I even realized that something special was happening. Like many, I took it for granted as a consumer and even as a creator. As open source continues to balloon and the burden placed on these nonprofits scales, our collective disregard presents an increasingly dire threat to the very things enabling the spectacular commons that is open source, our foundations. Today, I'm sharing this talk as a brief public service announcement. Then we're going to spend as much time as possible in conversation in the Q&A. But what happens tomorrow is what's most important. Will you look into the future and approach open source as a garden to be tended? Will you view financial support of foundations as charity or as an investment in our collective future and your ability to do business? Will you share what you've learned? Let's dive in. A brief history. In about 83, I believe it was, we got the 4 freedoms that begat the Debian Free Software Guidelines, from which we derived the open source definition in 1998. When we had these open approaches to licensing, and they took off, there was a Cambrian explosion of open source in the early 2000s, enabled by predictable licensing and largely centered around the LAMP stack: Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. In order to provide stewardship for these technologies, organizations were spun up like the Python Software Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, and the Drupal Association. Oh, and the Eclipse Foundation too. With this backdrop, okay, fine. Yes, I've already abandoned the building metaphor of foundations. It's important to view open source as an ecosystem. With this backdrop, we can understand the scale of the ecosystem that we're operating in and the role that each of us play and the different hats that we wear in this ecosystem. For instance, projects, maintainers, contributors, for-profits, nonprofits, including trade associations and charities, hobbyists, students, professionals, entrepreneurs, investors. All of these are stakeholders who have something to gain from open source. And we're all playing in the same space, each occupying an essential niche, each with different incentives, motivations, and goals. like an ecosystem, imbalance is a threat. When one component is too powerful or under-resourced, the whole thing is in jeopardy. Much has been made of this since 2014 in the wake of the Heartbleed vulnerability. We've seen a litany of research, initiatives, and events aimed at addressing what we call the sustainability problem. And while sustainability is absolutely an appropriate thing to discuss and explore, and of course it fits the ecosystem model, I worry we've spent too much time thinking about projects and not enough time focusing on the organizations that make their work possible, or on evolving the power dynamics. Look, just like sustainability is only one part of addressing the climate crisis, sustainability of open source projects is also only one part of addressing the issues we see in open source. With that scene set, let's talk about these foundations. Who are they? Well, we have the Open Source Initiative, OASIS, IEEE as examples of standards organizations. Open Source Initiative, a little different than the others, but broadly, all three of those organizations are looking after stewards on behalf of a whole ecosystem of different stakeholders. So we've got the standards bodies. And then we have, for instance, the Apache Software Foundation, the Python Software Foundation, and the Eclipse Foundation, who serve as project hosts. Then you have organizations like the Linux Foundation, which is a trade association as well as a project host. And you'll find that a lot of foundations play double duty like this. And then of course, we also have the Software Freedom Conservancy as an excellent example of an organization that is a combination of advocacy and project host. I should say, there are dozens and dozens of foundations. I'm picking just a few sort of archetypes here. And what do they do? What do these foundations do? Because they all have a different role to play. Okay, so you look at Open Source Initiative as a standards body, an organization that looks after the open source definition and runs the process by which we vet new licenses and consider them to be open source or not. OSI is an example of an advocacy organization and standards organization that, yeah, it does a little bit of project hosting as well, but not a whole lot. There's only one major project out of maybe half a dozen that OSI hosts. So we've got organizations like that. Then we have Software Freedom Conservancy as another, which, as I noted, does a little more advocacy, and their mission is explicitly about free software, or rather software freedom and user freedom. But they also play a role as a project host. This is my sidekick, Pico. Software Freedom Conservancy is an essential part of this ecosystem, just like OSI is, just like the Linux Foundation is. These foundations not only provide a home for projects, not only do they do advocacy work, but they provide fiscal sponsorship. You know, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a project host. A project needs a bank account. If we're talking about shared resources, we need a place to put those resources, from the financial resources to the intellectual property. We need a body that we can trust has some sort of governance in place. So when a foundation provides fiscal sponsorship for an open source project, what they're doing for us is they're providing us assurance that that project is going to behave in a predictable and stable fashion in a place that is neutral and not beholden to any one vendor. They'll also provide things like project infrastructure in some places. Really, the question of what a foundation does varies so much from case to case, but on the whole, it tends to be a mix of advocacy and that fiscal sponsorship for projects. Now, I've talked a little bit about some different examples of foundations. And I think it's important really to look at what the differences are so that we understand the role each serves. Every foundation is incorporated in some place, right? The Eclipse Foundation, as we know now, is beginning to it's incorporated in Canada, going to be incorporated in Brussels, I believe. And then we have organizations like the Linux Foundation, which is incorporated in the US. These things make a difference. You look at the Free Software Foundation Europe, you look at Linux Australia, where a foundation is incorporated is a meaningful detail, because that tells us about the rules that they're governed by. But that also tells us about where they have connections, where they have relationships, and where they can be most effective. So there's a geographic distribution of our foundations as one dimension of how they vary. Another way in which foundations vary is just their corporate DNA. Now, I live in the United States, so I have one lens on what that looks like. And it doesn't necessarily apply globally. But being that all of us have to deal with US-based foundations quite a lot, whether we like it or not, I will tell you a little bit about a meaningful distinction between the foundations here in the US. We have what are called 501c3, C3 nonprofit charities. And those are nonprofits that have a mission to serve the public, and they cannot engage in pay to play. These are projects that are foundations that are built to serve the public interest. And then we have C6 foundations, which is what we commonly call a trade association, which is can be more of a pay-to-play operation, where there are stakeholders being brought to the table who fund the organization and collectively work on their shared interests. And now often, folks like me are often known for casting that world in black and white and saying, okay, well, there's the 501c3s like the Open Source Initiative and Software Freedom Conservancy, and there are the C6s like the Linux Foundation. But honestly, it's actually not that clear. While the way that a foundation is incorporated tells you about how they're governed and what they can do and what their limitations are, it doesn't actually tell you about what their reality is. Because not every 501c6 trade association behaves like the Linux Foundation. For instance, I know that the Eclipse Foundation is incorporated that way, and it certainly doesn't behave like the Linux Foundation. So there's the geographic distribution, there's a difference in how they're incorporated, there's a difference in their missions. For instance, the Python Software Foundation has an obligation to Python specifically. The Apache Software Foundation has a pretty expansive mission dedicated to the Apache way in delivering open source. Linux Foundation, totally different mission. And look, all of these matter. All of these are important elements of our ecosystem. These organizations also vary on how they're governed. Some of them have elected boards, some of them have appointed boards, some of them have just very specific guidelines that these organizations have to abide by. So for instance, one of the projects that I participate in is the North Bay Python. It's a conference we hold here every year when there's not a pandemic. And North Bay Python is a Software Freedom Conservancy project. And when North Bay Python became a member project of Software Freedom Conservancy, there were obligations that we took on about how we run the project, about who can be in the project management committee, about how much representation we can have from any one company in that committee. These are rules put in place to make sure that the project behaves in a predictable fashion, and again, isn't beholden too much to any one vendor. Now, not every organization provides that much, is that opinionated about governance. There are lots of foundations that are happy to let projects define their governance for themselves. It's just important to be aware that this is one of the ways in which these foundations differ. And again, they're all important. They're all useful at a certain point in a project's lifecycle for a certain type of project. You'll also find that these foundations vary based on how they're funded. Many of them have individual memberships, low dollar amount recurring payments that people pay to support the work of the organization. Many of the organizations will accept sponsorships. Some of the organizations host events every year, which they use the ticket revenue, the excess from the ticket revenue and the sponsorships to fund the work of the foundation throughout the rest of the year. How organizations are funded varies pretty drastically from one to the next. And though they use generally the same toolkit, the proportionality of each of those funding sources, those revenue sources in their overall funding varies pretty drastically. Some organizations are a lot more individual driven, some are a lot more sponsorship driven, some are very event driven in terms of their funding. Again, these are all valid choices for these organizations to have made, but it's important for us to recognize how they differ in these ways. And I'll get to why. Every foundation also has an extremely variable level of support. For every well-funded foundation, which there are not all that many, there are probably half a dozen organizations, foundations that are really quite scrappy. You know, I serve as president of the Open Source Initiative, and while the open source definition is the cornerstone that makes all of modern software development as we know it possible, you know, enabling untold trillions of dollars of value to be created, the OSI annual budget is less than $500,000 a year. And I know that many of my peers in corporate open source are surprised when they hear that. There's this organization that is so essential to everything we do, and it's operating on a budget that supports only one and a half staff members. How is that sustainable? How is that healthy? It's not, and I'll get to that. But why do these foundations matter? You know, if it didn't come through in sort of the preamble and setting the scenery here, look, without foundations, there's no body to convene disparate stakeholders around shared interests. There's no vendor neutral territory. There's no one to equalize the playing field. Without foundations, open source would be less predictable, less stable, and more prone to gaming by well-resourced interests. So what's the fuss? Right, okay. Some of this sounds like maybe there's some issues that we need to be aware of, but like, how big is the problem really? I sound concerned. Should you be? Or am I just an alarmist full of hot air? Let me share just a few of the threats that we're facing. My first cause for concern. The Linux Foundation is very good at what they do. They fill a vital niche in this ecosystem. But it's not exactly a secret that they are the 800-pound gorilla in the foundation space. The Linux Foundation has a way of sucking all the air out of a room. And it has a poor record when it comes to supporting and shining a light on the rest of the ecosystem. Increasingly, I see the Linux Foundation as a risky single point of failure. And unless they change tack, I think their approach will not only weaken our ecosystem, but it'll diminish the very things that have made the Linux Foundation themselves successful to everyone's detriment. I'm hopeful though. There are great people within the Linux Foundation who recognize this issue and have been receptive to this feedback. So let's see what they do with it. The other issue, well, for-profit companies. They are, again, a vital part of this ecosystem. Like, I've spent a lot of time on this subject through my talks on open source citizenship, and many others are carrying the torch. So I'll keep this part of the presentation very short. Many companies have gotten far better about investing in the open source ecosystem, but we have a long way to go. I met a director of open source just a couple of years ago who didn't even know what the open source definition was, which is as much an indictment of corporate open source as it is of OSI's own outreach efforts, to be fair. Not only that, I've met people who work in corporate open source who don't actually know that there is an open source definition, who don't know about other foundations, which to me is just astonishing. Of all people who should know this, they should. We need companies to view investing in a diversity of open source projects and foundations as a necessary investment and get beyond this notion of open source as charity. Another threat. Open source fared well in the last economic downturn, but it was a fraction of its current size, and far fewer people and organizations relied on it the same way that they do now. In the economic downturn, the inability to hold events like PyCon and DrupalCon is a huge threat to the financial health of the organizations that steward the technologies we know and love. PyCon, for instance, the Python Software Foundation uses PyCon US to fund their year of activities and hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants. So though budgets are tight at for-profits who benefit from open source, the situation is even more dire in the nonprofit space. Some like to say we're in a post-open source world. That's their prerogative. We're here, and I think we know otherwise. I've dedicated plenty of time to that subject elsewhere, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But the too long didn't read, the TLDR, is that the open source definition has always been tested. And licensing evolves for many reasons: pursuit of profit, moral pursuits, and changing technology. This has hit a fever pitch. Activists, venture capitalists, and some corners of established industry are fighting tooth and nail to redefine open source. OSI and the rest of the foundation ecosystem has been on the case and still is. But we can't survive this alone. We need everyone to jump in. Those are just some of the threats that we're facing. And those are the threats that are top of mind for me and are particularly concerning when so many of us who labor in this industry don't know that our work rests on these nonprofits, and that so many of the companies we work for are not paying their fair share to support these foundations to make sure that we can do business today and tomorrow as well. So what can you do about these things? Well, you can become a member. I encourage you to become an individual or an organizational member of the foundations of the work whose work you rely on. I encourage you to sponsor foundations. They need it now more than ever. And honestly, working in corporate open source, I know that so often these sponsorships come out of the marketing budget, but my goodness, we need to stop looking at these as a marketing exercise and see these as an investment in foundations as an exercise in risk reduction and making sure that our business can continue on. We can volunteer. Many foundations rely on some level of volunteer labor, including board service. Get involved. And just participate. Respond to the surveys, participate in their mailing lists, their forums, their working groups. Again, run for their board of directors. You know, these foundations don't operate in a vacuum, and they're organizations that are meant explicitly to serve the community and the public interest. But they can only serve the public interest if the public is there at the table making their voices heard. You could get a job at a foundation. Look, we need good talent in foundations. And many people never even consider foundations as a possibility when they're on the job search. Just put that one in your back pocket for later, next time you're looking. Lastly, I encourage you to educate. Running into people who work in corporate open source who don't know that foundations exist, don't know that there's a definition of open source, don't know who the OSI is. That is an indictment of all of us, and we need to do better. And it's going to take you passing the word on to your colleagues, your friends, so that we can get beyond this lack of awareness to recognize the issues that we're facing and actually do something about it. What happens tomorrow is what's most important. Will you look to the future and approach open source as a garden to be tended? Will you view financial support of foundations as charity or as an investment in our collective future and your ability to do business? Will you share what you've learned? Thank you. I think we have just a couple minutes now for Q&A. The first question I have here is, how can we do better as a group to educate those corporate people who don't know enough about foundations? Beyond such great talks, thank you. Can we be more concrete about this education aspect? Absolutely. I think we have seen some good starts in this space. We have seen Sustain OSS, convene a conversation around sustainability of open source, mostly projects, but they're beginning to think about foundations. Out of Sustain, we've seen a FOSS Foundations working group right now that is specifically working on this education initiative that is spearheaded by Dwayne O'Brien at Indeed. But the bottom line is that we just need to make sure that foundations are a part of the conversation. When we talk about open source, let's make sure that we're including the foundations that support the project in question in that. And lastly, I would just ask people to talk about the foundations just a little bit more often, right? So long as that infrastructure is submerged and hidden from view and not often discussed, it's going to be hard to get over this issue that we have in awareness. So let's just talk about it a little more first. Okay, thank you very much. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of the event. Take care.